At the beginning of July 2007, Britain had braced itself yet again for a fresh wave of terrorist activities. The police and the security service arrested 7 people, including at least 2 actual perpetrators, suspected to be members of an Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorist cell, after the car bombs that they had hoped to detonate in London and Glasgow were detected and disabled. Since the horror of 7/7, Britain has been in a state of high alert. Anxieties regarding the general public sense of safety remain considerable. Images of Muslims as fanatical and violent, such as these, heighten the public's fears, and a critical question to which an answer was desperately needed after September 11, and one which is still at the top of the political agenda, is why some Muslims would wish to kill their fellow citizens, and in the process themselves, in an apparently indiscriminate fashion. Who are they? How can they be stopped and rooted out? As the title of my lecture suggests, looking at the Asian Muslim experience in Britain is a complex task. Clearly, this identity, Asian identity, Muslim identity, is composite. Asian, it's Muslim, and it's British. And it has 3 explicit dimensions: ethnic, religious, and national. Looking at that more closely, we find that each of these identities is itself complex. So if one looks at Muslim migration, the global Muslim population is itself doctrinally and ethnically diverse, while even in Britain, what we find is that the state that we are talking about is a composite state, comprising the English, Welsh, and Scottish nations. And if we are thinking about Asia, well, the continent of Asia would include much of the Middle East, as well as the Far Eastern Muslim world, stretching from Lebanon to Indonesia and beyond. Immigration has both an upside as well as a downside. Still others, feeling perhaps more vulnerable, view migrants as a burden on scarce resources, a source of social tensions, a source of threat to their own identity and to their society's stability, the society's harmony, the society's prosperity. For them, 21st century Britain, I'm talking mainly about Britain here, it almost seems like a foreign country, a direct consequence of it becoming a multicultural and multi-faith community. But what seems to have been forgotten is that immigration into Britain is nothing new. Britain has been a community of communities since time immemorial. It seems that's true of Barcelona as well. And the idea that Britain was ever a pure Anglo-Saxon Christian society before the arrival of people from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia is utter fantasy, an absolute myth. A myth, however, in which a large cross-section of the white population believes. So when we look at British history a bit more closely, what we discover is that everyone, all of us, have come from somewhere else. And that those who claim it's my country, so I have a greater claim than the immigrant, are very often themselves the descendants of immigrants who may have arrived and settled a few generations earlier than more recent newcomers. Perhaps the difference between nowadays and the pre-Second World War British society is that with the so-called non-white population increasing from 100,000 to over 4 million, it has become culturally and religiously much more diverse than before, which in many people's view has changed its social and cultural character. Asian Muslims as a community were no different from the other migrants who arrived and settled in Britain during various phases of its history. And if we wish to understand the current state of relations between Asian Muslims and British society, then it would be relevant to look at the history of their migration. What was the migratory process? The Asian presence in Britain can be traced as far back as the beginning of the 17th century. In the 19th century, significant numbers of Asians could be found in London as well as in the port cities such as Glasgow and Cardiff. In one sense, they're not necessarily a migrant community in the same way that, for instance, Jews who arrived at the end of the 19th century are not considered foreigners anymore. Once the British had established their dominance over India, in particular after their success in crushing the uprising of 1857 that ended Muslim rule, many in the Muslim elites of South Asia became convinced that if they were to achieve any of their social and economic aspirations in the new dispensation, then Western education probably offered the most convincing and suitable credentials for participation in the running of the colonial system. Consequently, from the mid-19th century, Indian students, many of them Muslims, began to arrive in Britain in a steady trickle. Others, a more motley crew, came in search of career opportunities, teachers of Asian languages, merchants and traders, street hawkers, musicians, itinerant surgeons, and higher up the scale, Indian Nawabs. From a few hundred thousand in number, in number 100 years ago, they now form the majority of 2 million or so Muslims living in Britain. That figure is from the 2001 census that I have there. Asian Muslims today are distributed into ethnically distinct communities, upholding a broad range of sectarian allegiances. It is true that the majority of Asian Muslims are concentrated in semi-skilled or unskilled jobs, living in multiply deprived and overcrowded inner city neighborhoods. Their children still go to under-resourced, virtually ethnically segregated schools, which provide substandard education. Their rate of unemployment is treble that of the white population. But a significant proportion, especially among the younger generation, have also become educationally and economically high achievers and can be increasingly found in the upper echelons of British political and public life, as I'll show later, as well as among some of the most prosperous professionals and entrepreneurs in the country. Therefore, contrary to stereotypical and popular perceptions of Muslims in Britain as an undifferentiated, fundamentalist group, one of the most striking aspects associated with British Asian Muslims, and I emphasize this, is the diversity that they represent. They are represented right across the religious spectrum, some devout, others less so, and others merely nominal. As individuals and groups, these Muslims offer an extensive range of interpretations and pursue a variety of strategies which shape their multiple and shifting identities. What we can see in these different responses, the variety of ways of being Muslim in Britain, a range of ways in which Muslims are constructing their identity. This has involved processes of negotiation with wider society and its institutions in which the vast majority of Muslims have not been seen, at least until recently, as anything else except outsiders rather than authentically British, and as they or their predecessors were predominantly ex-colonial subjects, they and their religion have frequently been perceived as inferior. As a result, Muslims in Britain face the challenge of constantly proving that do indeed belong to British society. This invariably produces tensions especially when it is perceived that a clash of basic values has occurred, such as during the satanic verses. I'm talking about Salman Rushdie here, in the 1980s. And more recently, the furor surrounding the publication of cartoons, the cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. Suspicions linger in the mind of the majority population that Muslims do not, and perhaps cannot, fully understand British society and its myriad institutions. For British Muslims, on the other hand, identification with a country that is seen as persecuting fellow Muslims abroad and whose institutions remain pregnant with Islamophobic attitudes is problematic.